Can you hear me, Bob?
Yep.
Okay, I had tried earlier and I couldn't get the audio to work. Thanks.
No problem.
Hola, gentlemen.
Hola, haven't seen you since church this morning.
Yeah, at least.
You look dour tonight, Bob.
No, just a little tired.
You out shoveling snow?
Not yet.
He's rooting for the Eagles.
Is that a bad thing?
They're getting creamed.
I talked to the Richters this morning. They were disgusted with the Patriots last night.
They got creamed.
Yeah, they did.
Who are the Eagles playing, Paul?
Tampa Bay.
Oh,
The
They're in the-
expatriate running them.
Yeah, so it's 31-7 in the fourth quarter, about 8 minutes to go.
Tampa Bay up.
Yeah.
I bet the Patriots wish they still had Tom Brady.
I don't know why they do that with athletes. Just because they're at an age level, but Brady has been special with the way he's taken care of himself his whole career. So
There's an article in the paper this morning, the Washington Post sports section, about how Brady does take care of himself, and not just physically, but mentally, how he boxes himself off and keeps other things from making demands on it.
yeah. Well, that doesn't keep him from
drives
doing-
his wife crazy.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't keep him from doing stupid stuff from time to time.
Well, he sure made an interesting pick in marriage. Let me go close that other curtain.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna go. I'll alert Sherry that we're on.
Good morning, Fred and Lois. Well, good afternoon, rather.
Well, you slept late this morning, didn't you?
I did.
It was a good morning to do it, looking out and seeing the snow accumulate out there. Of course, it didn't happen until this afternoon, so.
That's right.
But
I don't know how it is where you are, but of course, you're not very far away, but it's really coming down here.
We're all
Yeah.
white.
all white, street is covered.
And so our grass is still showing through the snow.
Oh, really?
How
Yep.
do you know?
Obviously, you didn't cut it short enough, Peter.
That's the giveaway there, Bob. It didn't get cut short enough because someone's wife could not start the mower.
We've been having a neighbor do it. And he's pretty good about it.
Good.
You all keeping well?
We are. We are.
Pete, we watched session 1, and we have to compliment you on putting it together in such a succinct way. I mean, it was a very good lead into the reading that we did when we read the 2 chapters or the 2 books of that you had assigned for tonight.
Well, I appreciate that.
We didn't want you to think that we were slackers.
Well, doing it in person and recording, it's clear that some people really don't want to drive in and risk the COVID issue, which is why we're recording it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's greatly appreciated.
And there's no sense in trying to get people to drive in the snowstorm.
No,
Then you've got people that are too far away to even drive. Have you
Well-
heard from Kim?
No, she's got a new email address and I made sure to hook her up with that. But I haven't heard from her. And-
Because she signed up is the reason I asked the
Yeah,
question.
she is.
Yeah.
And
I made
she's in
sure-
in the Richmond area, right?
Williamsburg area. Not Williamsburg, Wilmington area,
that's what,
Wilmington.
yeah, down in North Carolina.
Well, people down there.
yeah, I just found out last week that the, oh my gosh, the hoppers
Yes,
down.
they went down there and Dave Schreiber went down there.
Oh,
Angela Burns.
Angela Burns is down there.
Keeping tabs.
You want it on?
Yeah.
okay, she's in the Wilmington
I think Reggie's
Area.
going to have to put an
A
annex
satellite.
church down there.
Yeah,
That would be an idea.
in his spare time.
In his spare time.
I mean,
I
we
came
give
in the
him
other-
spare time.
I came in the other day to sign checks around 4 o'clock on Friday. And there was Reggie on a ladder taking the lights down. The little bulb lights that they got stapled to the edge of the eaves of the church, up on the ladder, taking them down.
Oh, I don't even know about those lights, I guess.
I never noticed him until I saw him taking them down, which I guess he put them up.
Most likely. And you probably didn't notice them because you weren't there at nighttime.
That's true.
That's why we didn't notice them.
Hi, Ed. Guess he's not really there.
Hey, Ed,
Good evening, good afternoon.
hey, by the way, Fred, you know, Ed is part-time now, facility master. I told him that you and I would help him whenever he needed it.
We're awfully good at giving advice, Ed.
That's true.
Our wives won't let us get our
Appreciate that.
hands dirty.
Well, besides which, our wives don't listen to our advice. So we want to give it to somebody else.
Hey, Paul can get his hands dirty around here anytime he wants.
Okay.
Denise is not participating, Ed?
She's over here, she's just not on the screen.
Ah,
She is listening.
no good. Say hi for me.
The couch is more comfortable than the chair in front of this desk.
Yeah.
I don't doubt that. If you see the back of Karen's head, because she's decided to sit in the couch behind me.
It sure is pretty outside.
Yeah.
Terry, it's always good to look at the bright side, and that was a good way to look at that snow coming down.
It
It
is.
makes for a beautiful scene.
It is gorgeous out here. Of course, the last one knocked down one of our, a remaining part of one of our trees, and it knocked down a couple of branches on another tree, another branch on another tree, and the bird feeder went down. So hopefully this will be kinder.
Well, this is a
Yeah.
light snow, it appears.
Yeah.
And it appears it's going to rain in the middle of the night, which should ease the burden on the trees.
If it
Yeah.
stays above freezing, we won't have ice in the morning.
Well, it's supposed to go up to 46 tonight. Who can
Well,
figure?
it didn't get up to 30. It didn't get to 25 at our house
I know,
today.
but it's supposed to get up to 46 tonight, which is amazing that it gets warmer at night.
I'll
Wow.
get Fred up to check that out about 3 a.m. See if that's-
You're so good to him, Lois.
I know. What can I say?
And if that happens, keep it to yourself. No need to share the news at that particular time.
Now Pat's laid back, sitting on the easy chair, just kind of,
Just hanging out.
nice to see the top of your head, Penny.
I was open the.
Yeah.
I can't sit much closer, so I've got to adjust the, there we go.
Penny, it would work if you had some blue waves at the bottom of your screen, so you could be like this, you know, head just above the water.
Well, I could pile up all the junk that's in this room and then it'd be the same thing. I'm almost underwater.
If you need any more junk, we have plenty of it to share with you.
Yeah, we have just enough room on the table for the laptop. The rest of the table is covered with Christmas stuff.
We finally got all our Christmas stuff put away. Karen did most of the work.
Yeah. Something I put off as long as possible. I just realized how close Valentine's Day was and it kind of scared me. So,
Karen says that the plow has just come down our.
Yep, we got a
cul-de-sac.
snowplow. Last time we didn't get one at all.
oh,
Oh, yay.
yeah. Well, now we got them early on last time. Maybe we'll get missed this time. I don't know.
Who knows?
We had one year that we had a lot of snow and the plows never came and we had to dig it out. And it was about 4 feet.
3 guys had blowers, 2 or 3, and the rest of
Oh.
everybody had shovels, and we just did it.
Yeah,
Wow.
was that back in the late 80s?
Maybe.
I'm talking
No,
about. yeah.
Snowmageddon? When was Snowmageddon? Our kids were, grandchildren were little.
Snowmageddon
10 years
was
ago.
2010.
10.
2010.
Yeah, that was when our grandkids were little.
That's 11 years.
And then the last big one is about 15 or 16,
Yeah,
January.
yeah.
okay, it's a little bit after 4. So if everybody would
Stay
mute,
out this way.
we'll go ahead and
Start
start.
not in the recording.
I'm going to start with a prayer and say, Lord, thank you for bringing us together by Zoom in the face of this weather. Watch over those who are out in it and bring them back to their homes safely. Give us an opportunity to hear what you have to say and to interpret it. In Jesus' name we ask, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, tonight we're talking about Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Thessalonica was the capital of Macedonia. It actually was named in 316 after Alexander's sister. It's on the Via Egnita, and the handout I gave you showed the little red line that runs from the Strait of Bosphorus all the way across the top of Macedonia to the Aegean Sea. It was a major road. 2 of the towns on it we'll talk about. Philippi is between the Bosphorus and Thessalonica. We'll talk about that several lectures later. It had a heavy Greek presence, but it had a good relationship with the emperor of Rome. And so it was filled with Romans and Roman gods, and especially with an altar to the emperor. We talked before about how worshiping the emperor helped protect the empire. And so it was common, regardless of what other gods that you noticed. It was predominantly non-Jewish craftsmen, merchants, and lower classes, which of course is heavily in the slave business. In Acts, this is part of the 2nd missionary trip. But of course, Paul never kept track of his missionary trips like that. That's something that happened years later when they're trying to put it all together. Acts had him stay in Thessalonica for 3 weeks. When you read 1 Thessalonians, it's apparent that he was there longer than 3 weeks. Not that it's a big issue, but it is a difference. He says that he had opposition in Philippi. Acts says very specifically that he was lashed in Philippi, and one of the reasons that he left and headed to Thessalonica. He's pretty sure it was some disagreement, and we don't exactly know what. There was disagreement in Thessalonica as well, we find in Paul's letter, and he went to Athens. And after a while, he sent Timothy back to check on Thessalonica and how they were coming. And this letter he writes after Timothy came back to Athens after Thessalonica. And it's written from Corinth, which is where he went after Athens. This is one of the consensus Paul letters. I talked last time about how there are 3 groups, so 7 letters that everybody agrees were written by Paul, 3 others that people debate, and 2nd Thessalonians is one of those, and then 3 others that most scholars don't think he wrote that were written by a disciple of him later on. So we're going to start with 1 Thessalonians, but I wanted to define 3 terms. The word Parousia. which means the second coming. That's used commonly in Bible commentary. Also the eschaton, which, and I sent the definition of these out to you by email. I hope you all got those. And eschatology, which is the study of the end of times and how it happens. These words all deal with some of Paul's comments in his letters. He starts off with an address and a thanksgiving, which is what he starts all his letters with. Here he's saying that he's greeting them from himself, Silvanus, and Timothy. Timothy comes in the headlines several times in his letters. He thanks them for their endurance. Now, thanking them for their endurance implies that there's something that they endured, not just life. And he will also talk about perseverance, which also implies some opposition somewhere. He thanks them for impersonating him. Now, that really means acting like he acted. Some of that could refer to the way he worked with his hands, because he encourages people to do that later on. Some of it also could just be in the way he believes and preaches. He also cites them, and he does this several times in his letters, as examples to all Macedonia. He's very, very happy and comfortable with the Thessalonians. It's a very warm and loving letter, and it's very tinged with family, as we'll see several times during the discussion of the letter. He does say that he suffered in Philippi, matches up with Acts that something happened in Philippi that caused him to leave. He took time to emphasize the authenticity of his ministry. He does this without even talking about what happened on the road to Damascus. He says that he was approved by God and entrusted with the message. There are several other letters where he specifically cites the road to Damascus and why that came about. And he cites specifically the salvation through faith in Christ, another theme that will run through his letters. He specifies that he was unselfish and he worked. He worked to support himself so they wouldn't have to. This actually balances against what we saw earlier, which were wandering philosophers and miracle workers that came to town and asked for money in response for their preaching. And he's very clearly saying, I don't do that. I support myself and I am preaching the gospel for the sake of the gospel. And all through this, he talks as a nurse, talks about mother, he talks about father, he talks about family, uses the word Adelphia, which are friends and brothers and sisters. This is a theme that runs all the way through here, and I'll get to the implications of that at the end of the discussion. There's a second thanksgiving following that first verse, which is odd for Paul's letters. He praises them for having welcomed the word of God. Obviously, he is serious that they are listening. They listened to him, they imitated him, and they are living the way that he had preached that they should live. Again, he cites persistence and that they're a model for all of Macedonia. Now, here's the next series, the next couple of verses are a little controversial. He says that they acted just like the church in Judea acted. That would be Jerusalem. And he talks about how they were persecuted and how he was banned from talking to the Gentiles. We don't find that in anything in the New Testament where he was banned from talking to the Gentiles. In fact, it's clear from one of his visits to Jerusalem that he was entrusted with bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. In fact, he has a phrase, says, talking about the Jews who killed the Lord and prophets. And Bob, you can jump in here if you do, but I don't recall much in the Old Testament about the Jews killing their prophets. Jesus, yes. Prophets, I'm not sure about. He says they drove us out, banned us speaking to Gentiles, that God's wrath has come upon them. None of that really tracks with what we know about what was going on in Judea. And it's so anti-Jewish in the fact that he was a Jew. He always was a Jew. He believed in the Jewish heritage, and it's hard to find that he would consider himself one who killed Christ. At any rate, many scholars think this could well be a later edition. It certainly doesn't fit comfortably with the rest of his letter. Then we get to Timothy. I mean, remember, he had a purpose for writing this letter. It was in response to Timothy coming back to him and bringing news from Thessalonica. And in many cases, it's very positive news. They are living the lessons he taught them. They're a family of Christ. They're models for all of Macedonia. He talks about, when he starts discussing the visit by Timothy, how they are orphans because he's not there. Again, that family motif. He says he's held back in Athens by Satan, and this is never clear what that means. We don't have anything in Acts about any kind of opposition in Athens. We have the session where he spoke to the philosophers, but that doesn't imply any kind of persecution. But at any rate, because he couldn't make it, he sent Timothy, because he wanted to reinforce what they had, and he wanted to get what questions they had. He rejoiced in the good news. He talked about them standing firm, about having faith and love for Paul. In other words, his departure clearly was not something that he had controversy with the church. And we'll talk about that, what that controversy might be later on. But he was certainly happy that they were thinking kindly of him. He took a break. And something he does in all of his letters is he gave them some ethical admonition. One of the things we find in several of them is live a life of purity. Don't fornicate. And this we'll see in 1 Corinthians and in Romans also. Work quietly with your hands. Again, it goes back to what he was doing and his belief that people should work. And in fact, we see when he talks about the Parousia that there are people who don't want to work because they think it's already come. So it's a theme that runs through this. Behave properly towards outsiders. Don't wrong each other. This reflects the love thy brother as thyself, which is very Old Testament Jewish guidance. Mind your own affairs and overcome temptation. And it's all very different from the way that Gentiles lived. There are some scholars who think that this concept of family and treating each other fairly and as human beings may have attracted some of the Gentiles who weren't used to that. That this may have been something that said these people live differently, and it seems to be, I like the way they live. And that may have attracted some people to go and try to find out why. In any case, Timothy came with a question. The Thessalonians were worried about what happened to those who died. Will they be present at the Parousia for the kingdom? Now, there's some implications of that particular question. First, it's probable that those who died refers to people who had heard the gospel from Paul before he left and had died subsequently that. Because he's preaching that Jesus is the first fruits, he is resurrected from the dead, and the Parousia, the second coming, is coming shortly. And so it appears that there are people who went through that beginning discussion and have died. And so the Thessalonians are worried about, if we're going to be raised up, what about the dead? And so that brings up a question that runs through Paul. It's called the already and the as yet to come. In other words, Jesus's resurrection as first fruits was the beginning of the coming of the kingdom. And yet it's not going to fully come until he comes back, the Parousia. And so there's that gap of time between the beginning and the actual execution. And so it's kind of a between times, and it's a tension that runs through it. It's the tension that led some people to stop work because the Parousia was coming. It's a tension that causes them, what do I do to live with the Greeks in a sinful environment? an evil environment while I am still waiting for the Parousia to come that will set me apart, take us up to the air, and get rid of the unbelievers, so to speak. So this tension runs through it. It's clear that they expected the Parousia to come soon. Paul says, we who are alive. It reflects Jesus's comment, there are those of you standing here who will be alive at the second coming. And so it's clear that in this early letter to the Thessalonians, their belief is it's coming soon. And his guidance to them as children of the light versus children of the dark is be sober and awake. Don't sleep. It will come as a thief in the night. In other words, quietly. Suddenly it will happen. And you have to be prepared for it. And destruction will fall upon those who are not. It will be led by a trumpet of the Lord. It's one of my favorite phrases he uses, don the breastplate of faith and love. I mean, I think that's a really great comment. And of course, it's all through salvation in the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, he does talk some about life in the church. Now, churches, as we talked about earlier, are not mega cathedrals. They're house churches. They're small groups. And so he says, respect your leaders, but doesn't specify any kind of a leadership structure that we get in later letters in Timothy and Titus, where we've got deacons and bishops. And this, he doesn't talk about those. He just says church leaders. He wants consideration for those in need. This is another theme that runs through his letters. The teacher I had for the New Testament in seminary had written a great book on Paul and the needy and how Paul's letters apply to taking care of those in need. And so that's a specific guidance he puts here. Don't repay evil with evil. In other words, turn the other cheek in a different way. Pray unceasingly. He comes back to no work, no play. For those who think the kingdom has come and so you don't need to work anymore, get off that, keep working until the second coming. Abstain from every form of evil and cultivate spiritual gifts. He doesn't say what those spiritual gifts are here. We will get to that in 1 Corinthians, where he's very specific about what the spiritual gifts are. And then he has a concluding, and he's got a great verse here that I'm going to use for the farewell prayer when we get to it. So that's kind of what he says. And we've talked about why he wrote it. Clearly, it was in response to Timothy's report back to him in Corinth. Timothy had been out, he'd reviewed it, he has sat with them, found out what they're doing, what they're believing, and brought a question back. And so he wrote it. It's filled with love and encouragement and compliments. You're models for all of Macedonia. You're following my advice. You're loving God. And so he's full of that. It is also clear that he's refreshing his teaching in some ways after, I'm not sure what. There was a problem pushing him out of Thessalonica. Some people say that it was the Jews who threw him out. I said earlier, there weren't a lot of Jews in Thessalonica. It was mostly Greeks, either of native Greeks or Romans. But one of the theories is that it was the Jews who threw him out, and that's documented with or supported by his anti-Jewish screed in the 2nd chapter. But it's most likely that it was Roman antagonism. Remember, I said that emperor worship was a fairly predominant issue in Thessalonica, and his emphasis on peace and security through Jesus, through Christ, flies in the face of peace and security supported by the emperor. So I think it's more probable that it was Roman objections that ran him out. Something that supports that, the Jewish part, though, is the fact that Acts says he was flogged. It supports the Roman part that he was flogged because flogging was a Roman punishment. When the Jews used manual punishment, it was with rods, beat him with a stick, so to speak. And so Acts complement talking about the flogging may imply that some of the issue was with the Romans. And so he was responding in trying to refresh them after that particular event. And of course, the key piece was answering the question he brought to Paul from the Thessalonians on the Parousia. And this is one of the issues that comes up with the second letter we'll talk about in a few minutes. Paul doesn't preach theology in these letters, except for Romans. Roman is thick with theology because he's trying to convince the church in Rome of what he believes on his way. In the letters to the different churches, he's specifically responding to issues that had come up in that particular community and that have come back to him either with a letter, as we'll see in Corinthians, or through Timothy. And so he's trying to respond and try to help them. So you have to kind of pick and choose and interpret what he says to put his theology together as what that theology is. It's clear that there's one God. And as much as we say, well, they're polytheists, this must have been a big stretch for them. Not as much as we think, because there were philosophers in Greece, in that whole area, who believed there was a big major God and all the other gods worked for him. And so the concept that there was one God is not completely out of line with there's a major God, because it just kind of eliminates all the middlemen, so to speak. But it's clear that he was a staunch monotheist. He had a couple of workhorses he hits over and over: faithfulness, love, and hope. We'll see that in Corinthians also. It's clear that he was talking about the immediacy of the Parousia when he was in Thessalonica the first time and responding to their question. He talks about we who are alive. He was expecting this to happen early on. Now, we'll see when we get to what they call the captivity letters, when he was in captivity and writing to churches, that later on, some of his approach was not immediate, that it was still to come, the as yet part of the already and as yet. He's got a large piece of theology that deals with the Christian family. We are all families in Christ. He talks about mothers, orphans, fathers, brothers and sisters. And that has some attractiveness to the Gentiles, because we talked last week about how one of the organizations that built the hierarchy was family, city, and empire. And so when you present the Christian community as the family of Christ, you're attracting people to join that family and share in the salvation. And so there's a certain amount of attractiveness that comes to that. Steadfast trust in face of paganism, or in the face of opposition, which he cites several times. And again, Jesus was resurrected, and he's going to come again, and that will raise us all up. So that whole idea of a second coming and the coming of the Parousia and the end of time and realization of the kingdom is soon. That's what we find in the first one. And of course, serving God and waiting for his son and being obedient in that between times, between the already and as yet. That's all the theology that you can pick out. And I'm sure that others can pick additional theological points out of this. It's not his most rich. I think that the First Corinthians is easier to do, and there's a lot more to stick a fork in First Corinthians and then First Thessalonians. But that's First Thessalonians. Before I go to Second Thessalonians, are there any questions about First Thessalonians? You're on mute, Paul.
Not a question, but one of the theories about him focusing on the second coming and the involvement of those who are dead in that event was that he knew that very likely many of them were going to be dying because they were following Christ. And if so, don't worry about it because you're going to be there for the real important stuff at the second coming.
He does say that you need to be prepared to suffer. But remember, he wrote this around 50 ballpark AD. And at 50 AD, there wasn't a serious persecution going on. That came later. And so the fact that people would be killed for their belief wasn't quite as imminent as it was later on. Possible they could be imprisoned, but the persecution wasn't as blatant and obvious as it became later. Paul?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to recap. You said this is his second missionary trip?
That's what Acts says.
Okay, so in the first one, where was he? Was he basically in Asia, then the
Yes.
cities of Asia?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so he was traveling to the west. After that, he crossed over and went over through Philippi into
Right,
Thessalonica.
right.
Okay, because, yeah, I tend to believe that it's also connected, that gives us context for helping us understand why he was there and what was going on.
Yeah, he doesn't try to do that. But like I said in the first one, he wasn't keeping a travel log.
Yeah.
He was just doing things. And it were later writers who tried to organize what Paul did and put it in the structure that you're talking about. All right, you need to go back on mute. Okay, I'm going to go to 2 Thessalonians. This will be controversial to some. There's considerable debate about whether this letter, along with Colossians and Ephesians, were actually written by Paul. And I will get to that. If it's by Paul, it was probably written between 51 and 52 AD. If it's not by Paul, it was probably written between 70 and 100 AD. And I'll come back to something that Fred said is one of the arguments that it was written later. He opens this letter with a greeting and thanksgiving, which, by the way, is pretty much identical to that in 1 Thessalonians. He has a thanksgiving prayer in a couple of verses, tying to all believers with shared beliefs. He talks specifically about struggles, about persecution and crushing distress, not opposition, mind you, but crushing distress. And that there's where you find suffering shows worthiness. Jesus suffered, we're suffering. It is showing our worthiness of being raised up. And that God will give relief to those who are suffering and punish those who are, or actually eternal destruction is what he says, for those who are causing that distress. And again, repay affliction with affection, and thanksgiving to the Thessalonians with their faith and love that will save them for the Parousia. And again, the persecutors will be punished anew. Again, the stress, the punishment of the persecutors comes over and over in 2 Thessalonians. It's a different mood from 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians is very loving and family-like and accepting, whereas 2 Thessalonians has a colder approach, more talk about persecution and about destruction to your enemies than you find in the 1 Thessalonians. The other biggest issue that comes about is how he treats the Parousia in 2 Thessalonians from what 1 Thessalonians. He starts out by saying, don't listen to what other people tell you. Whether it's by letter or by false preaching, don't listen to what other people are telling you about the Parousia. Other letters are not from us. There's an implication there that because this is the first letter, the second letter that we know of. It implies that there are other preachers because he's saying don't listen to them. And there are people who are doing counterfeit miracles and signs. Again, I talked about that at the beginning where people would travel around and doing that and get paid, get sustainment out of that. And in response to that issue about other people coming and doing these things, he's saying, remember, I supported myself. I didn't cost you anything. And so I have a certain validity because I'm here preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, not trying to make money out of the deal. And he talks about staying away from brothers and sisters who don't follow us, meaning Paul and Timothy. So again, there's an implication there that there is somebody else or some other people preaching, and some of those who were brothers and sisters have strayed to that thought. We see that again in 1 Corinthians, and we see it strongly in Galatians when we get to that. Galatians being the most direct and hard over angry letter that he wrote. And again, he talks about if they're not working, they don't eat. Pretty harsh, but the harsh statement certainly implies that there were those who really thought, in this case, not that it was soon, and I'll get to it in a minute, that it had already happened. And so that's why they're not working. And now he gets to the apocalyptic signs. Apocalypse, by the way, doesn't mean disaster. It means revelation. And that, the apocalypse is what the Greek name for Revelation, the book of Revelation is. And so he's very much showing signs that are going to come before the Parousia. It's going to come. But before it comes, it's not going to come like a thief in the night. There's going to be rebellion. There's going to be apostasy. The lawless one, but not mentioned elsewhere, and the lawless one has been translated as Satan. It's also, in a Semitic reference, can be a being or a process, the lawless one. But the lawless one is already at work, and he's being held in abeyance by somebody or something not determined. And then ultimately he will be released to wreak havoc on the world and destroyed by the Lord. What is this? What is this hinting of? Revelation. The concept that what we find in Revelation pretty much follows that same thought process that he's arguing is the sign of the coming Parousia. And so they should stand firm and strengthen their hearts. That's a pretty strong statement compared to coming like a thief in the night. He gives a thanksgiving at the end with instructions on God choosing them for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ, and that Jesus's resurrection was the first fruits of the coming. He gives some ethical admonitions. Again, don't work, don't eat. And in this case, it's not because it's coming soon, but some of these people apparently thought it had already happened. And since it had already happened, I don't need to work. It's a waste of time. And so he's got that same counsel. And again, he counsels that if people are not being obedient to what we preached, ignore them and shun them. And that's an issue that comes up in several of his letters. What do you do about the brothers and sisters that have strayed? And we find that really in latter-day North Africa, after the church has been established, when the persecutions are violent and martyrdoms are up, and there were people who refuted Christianity in order not to get crucified, or not to get tortured to death. And then when that was over, they wanted to come back to Christianity. And so how do you treat those brothers and sisters who strayed and are coming back? And that split North Africa badly, with those who wanted to punish them and those who wanted to accept them a long time in the future. And finally, he gives a conclusion and a greeting. It's a short letter. It's only 3 chapters. Why did he write it? He's not responding to any letter that we know. He's not responding to any messengers he's received. Timothy hasn't come back and said, hey, boss, there's a problem. This is going badly. We just don't know. It could be that it's in response to the continuous conflict that had happened before. And when he was talking about opposition and persecution in 1 Thessalonians, it could be that that has gotten worse. Somehow he's got word of this in Corinth, and he's writing in response to it. He's trying to provide encouragement for them in faith. That thing, suffering like Jesus suffered, is kind of encouragement for those who are undergoing that. clearly there's some backsliding going on, because several times he talks about how to deal with recalcitrant brothers and sisters who have strayed from the word. Talks about stiffening the spines and the fate of unbelievers. This is another piece that's very strong here, that eternal destruction is going to come for those who have strayed, or for those who are not having faith in Jesus Christ. There's a confrontation over whether the eschatology has been realized or is yet to come. Already is yet to come, and some have said, well, I don't care about this middle times. I'm going with the the already realized, and I'm going to act that way. All right. Was this letter written by Paul? That is the scholarly question. And it's a fairly debated one. I've got N.T. Wright, who is very solidly on the fact that, yes, it was. Despite doubts, it was definitely written by N.T. Wright. On the other hand, Raymond Brown, who is a Catholic theologian, Bible history, and Bart Ehrman, and the International Bible Commentary, all sit on the side that it was not. It was written later by a disciple of Paul. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the arguments for and against. And I have an opinion, but you would expect that based on what I think the overpowering argument is, but you all can read it how you want to read it and take whatever you want. For those who say it's not by Paul, I'm going to list some things, some of which are pretty intangible. It's more impersonal than 1 Thessalonians. There may be reasons for that, but it's certainly not as loving, family-oriented as 1 Thessalonians is. The grammar and vocabulary, none of us are qualified to deal with that. But those who are state that the grammar and the vocabulary in 2 Thessalonians match closely Colossians and Ephesians, but don't match the other known letters of Paul. Okay. And I'll skip ahead, and one of the counter arguments to that is, yeah, but a lot of it does. And so somebody's saying, well, some of it doesn't and some of it does. He cites every letter. And the interpretation here is that may be an attempt to enforce the fact that this is a real letter. But again, that's supposition. And it is not something that you can put your fork into and say, that's it. There are oblique references to forgeries. Now, there's a difference between what we call pseudographia, which are letters written in the name of somebody by someone who's a disciple, and outright forgeries. And we find outright forgeries in the whole biblical process that are very clear that somebody wrote them and had nothing to do with what they're talking about. But he mentions forgeries in this, which would imply that I'm writing this letter and it's not a forgery. It's a real letter on it. The clearest and most specific of the issues is his treatment of the Parousia. It is very, very different. Thief in the night, the lawless one, destruction coming, everything being turned over. That's very, very different from the thief in the knife on that. And it reflects. Karen is rooting through here looking for something.
I have a question.
Pete, I don't want to interrupt you, but what does Perusian mean?
Oh, you missed that.
Yeah,
It's the second coming.
Second coming.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, you checked in. You signed on after I'd already talked about that. That's all right. He talks about the destruction of the unbelievers. And in fact, a lot of the words he uses about the violence and the evil and the confrontation of the evil is reflects Revelation in a lot of ways. And remember, Revelation was written circa 90 AD. So that evil on a large scale ties into that. Now, the other piece that they raise against it is this is supposed to be a year later. And it would appear that what's going on in Thessalonica at this point is much more violent and disruptive than was going on in the first Thessalonian letter. And so there's a tendency to say, all right, all of these things add up. And this was written later, and apparently much later, because of its reflection of a later eschatology of it. So those are the arguments against it. N.T. Wright's arguments for it are pretty clear. It says it's from Paul. There's lots of shared vocabulary. Yes, the vocabulary and the sentence structure is different, but on the other hand, there's a lot of it's that's the same, so you can't make that of it. He may have had another secretary, one of the other secretaries writing it for him and use different phraseology and sentence construction. So you kind of dip that off. There's shared ideas. This idea of no work, no food, that's in both of them. The ethical guidance is the same in both of them. The use of similar phrasing. The Parousia and the eschatology is similar to that listed in several of the Gospels. But of course, the Gospels were written much later than Paul's letter to Thessalonica. So there are some warm remarks too, and that could offset the coolness. And so if you've got intangibles that say it's different, you're pretty much left with the two issues of what happened in the 1 year difference to make things so much worse in Thessalonica, and also the whole concept of the Parousia and the second coming. I mean, that's a very different picture of both of them. So you're left with those two as you try to make that judgment. And as I said, these are not, this book is not, it is debated, which it's called Deutero-Pauline. Anyway, Karen's got a question.
I can wait till the
No,
end.
you
but
can
this
ask it.
keeps coming to me over and over. Couldn't Paul have just changed his view in this year about these factors, the Parousia and the whole? Maybe he'd become more frustrated with what was going on, maybe because of the violence, maybe because of just he wasn't seeing people following him the way he wanted to. All
Sure.
of the above.
Sure.
Couldn't he have just changed his, written it a little more?
And as I said, when we get in, did you all hear that? As I said, when we get into some of his later letters, it's clear that he has changed his mind, that he's not talking about the immediacy of the Parousia. The issue, I think, on that becomes that it is so close to the dates proposed for the first letter, between the first and second letter, it would be a major jump for him to change his concept of the Parousia. It could be that things have gone to hell in a handbasket,
Sounds to me
and that he's doing that. That's quite possible. We don't know. But for him to have changed that particular key piece of his view of the Parousia is probably a stretch. But again, none of this is, it's all debated, still debated. I gave you two major biblical scholars that have different opinions, Raymond Brown and N.T. Wright. They both fall on different sides of the fence. And so you kind of got to put that fence where you want to fence. And then you have to ask the question, which I said in the earlier class when I talked about the differences between Paul's letters and Acts. How does it affect your theology? There are things that are different in the Bible that may or may not affect your theology, and you're the only one who can grasp that. Does it affect your faith? There are pieces of this that are consistent between the two letters. He always talks about brothers and sisters. He talks about Christ's family. He talks about love and faith, talks about doing well to each other, treating each other, love your neighbor as yourself. He talks about that in both letters. He admonishes them and tells them not to reject the idols. There are some differences. The lawless one is one. Is that a theological issue? I think that's more of an eschatology issue than a theological issue. Those other things that he says in encouragement to the Thessalonians in this letter are theological, and they tie in often with other letters that he wrote, and we'll see as we get into them. Galatians is a little different next week. Galatians is, like I say, an angry letter. The Galatians have done some things that have really disturbed him. But then we'll get into 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and we can talk about those. Those are pretty full of theology, I think, in the answers to the questions he's answering. Okay. That's about what I have for Thessalonians. I'm open for questions now. Or you can scream at me. So you have ruined my life.
I have one more terminology question.
Okay.
Eschatology.
You didn't read the email I sent. Because I sent an email.
I read Thessalonians, both of them.
I sent another email out that had a
Yeah.
definition of eschatology. Eschatology is the study of the end of times,
On with
and the
Parousia.
eschaton is the end of times.
Okay.
So when we're talking about the eschatology, it is trying to figure out what's going to happen when all this comes to be. And that's what that means from a Greek.
Is it consistent with Revelation, or is that's the thing that struck me, is because this is the first, I've read it numerous times, Thessalonians, but for some reason I just read Revelation before January 1st, because that's the end of the Bible reading program I'm on. But so is it consistent with Revelation in terms of how he views what's going to happen at the end of the age?
What he says in 2nd Thessalonians is, I would call it reflective of Revelation. It's similar things. You've got the lawless one, you've got him restrained, you have him being released, you have him rampant, bringing hellfire and damnation, and then he's being suppressed and beaten. That is a storyline that you can find in Revelation. I don't know that it's exactly the same thing at all. But that is a reflection of Revelation.
In the Gospels, they have 3 different places in the Synoptic Gospels where Jesus talks about the end times, and some of those same themes show up.
They do.
Yeah.
But keeping in mind that the earliest gospel, and you can argue with this in your own class, but the earliest gospel was Mark around 65. And that's about 3 years after Paul died. And the other gospels are as late as mid-80s.
That's true. But the key thing that I would offer in conflict with that is that ostensibly these are the words of Jesus. And so when it was written is somewhat irrelevant.
Okay, I'm not going to get in an argument about it.
But Jesus does address the issue.
He does.
And that's, so we take that at face value.
All right. Other questions? Now you guys are all excited about listening to Bob.
No, it just leaves me with so many questions, because I'm kind of one of those people that believe Matthew wrote Matthew and John wrote John.
Oh boy.
I'll leave that out for Bob, but I will tell you this.
King James Version.
That having gone through the seminary course on the New Testament,
Yeah.
those gospels weren't named until the middle of the 2nd century. until then, they were just gospels among many. They weren't assigned names until the middle of the second century, about 150.
And remember, each of them says according to.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I mean, it is difficult for those who have been raised, as Karen has, as I was, that this is exactly what it is. It's named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them.
Yeah.
I got that. I understand that. I will tell you that modern scholarship casts doubt on that concept. Doesn't cast doubt, as I said before, on the theology of it. Doesn't cast doubt on what's said, only who is attributed to the author. Really, we know the letters of Paul were written by Paul, most of them at least. We can attribute them all to Paul. We know that Revelation was written by John of Patmos.
It says so.
Say again?
It says that.
It says that. I mean, he says,
Yeah,
by John
yeah.
of Patmos.
Yeah.
And so we're pretty sure about those. There's no specific documentation on any of the rest. For years, Hebrews was attributed to Paul. And it's been in the last 50 years that the consensus is, A, Hebrews isn't a letter, it's a sermon, and B, it wasn't written by Paul. Theology is completely different. I mean, so when you get into these different scholarships, and to do something like this, I do about 4 or 5 books and commentaries to put it together. And so when you get into that, you find different opinions about how some of these things came together on it. And this flies in the face of Bob, but I will tell you that one of the most interesting questions I ever had in a class was when I was talking about John. The guy in the back of the classroom raised his hand and said, I have a question. I said, okay. He said, who took notes on all of these 2-chapter long speeches?
Good question.
You know, it's a good question.
It's a darn good question.
I don't know. But at any rate, so, I mean, there are things that come up when you start working on it. And that was a young man who just hadn't studied much in the Bible, but that was a question he had.
Well, and the other part of that is that it's worth remembering, this was all written in Greek. And so you had to have somebody, first of all, that was literate, and secondly, literate in Greek.
Yep. No wonder.
And so that makes the question a little more complicated because the vast majority of people in that day and time were not literate.
10% were literate. And in fact, the Bible says that John was illiterate.
Yep.
Oh, that's in the Bible.
Then obviously the question is, if that's true, can it be the John that we know that the
We just don't know.
disciple that Jesus loved?
We just don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, other questions. Paul, you've wandered through the New Testament a number in your Sunday school classes. Do you have anything to add?
I'm just thinking about the discussion on the different opinions on the timing of the letters. And just thinking that, today our communication is instant. And of course it wasn't back then. I can't tell how far apart or how long it took to travel between these cities and how long, news went, but we're talking here, First Thessalonians in AD 51 time frame, Thessalonians 2, but you said about a year later. That comports with what my Bible is telling me, 51, 52. So you get the first letter, you let things simmer for a while, and then news filters back to you while you're down in Corinth saying, hey, this is what's going on. It's continuing. And this is where the people are. What do you think? And so a letter is composed and then sent back up the pike from Corinth back up to the folks. So, it with a little bit of a different tone. So I think it's highly realistic to come down with Paul doing both of these.
It's certainly realistic with Corinthians, because it's clear that he responds to letters from Corinth. In the Corinthian letters is an Ephesus, which is much further away than Thessalonica is from Corinth.
Yeah, you gotta go across the GNC to get there.
It's a long way, but
Yeah.
Paul writes in response to Corinth, the letters from Corinth in that. And so there's a certain give and take in exchange in the information between that. And you're right, it's certainly possible. I've got no finite answers here. I can just raise the issues.
Yeah, if you're gonna invoke NT Wright, I'm gonna go with that.
And not Herman.
No, Raymond Brown.
Yeah. Reggie doesn't cite him.
Other question, but Fred, you got some?
Not a question, but a comment. My Bible mentions that the wordings between the two letters, and the phraseology of it, could have been that different scribes
I said that.
were used,
I said that.
and which implies that that a lot of the things in the Bible were transcribed by scribes. You know, basically someone spoke
Sure.
and
It's also been said, well, yeah, John was illiterate, but he could have toked it and somebody wrote it down. That's all true. And Paul could well have used Sylvanus or Timothy, probably not Timothy, but he could have had Sylvanus write it, and that could account for the difference in vocabulary and sentence structure. Doesn't necessarily reason why that sentence structure and vocabulary would be so close to Corinthians and Ephesians. But who knows? We don't
Of
know.
course, it's important to remember its sentence structure in Greek,
Yes,
not English sentence structure.
It's in Greek.
No
it's in Greek.
sentence structure person.
Oh, Greek does have an
Oh, Greek
elaborate,
does, yeah.
elaborate
It's-
sentence structure with a
It does.
very confusing verb structure. I got to tell you, having tried to so far get through Greek, the verb structure is
That's right. It's.
vocabulary is easy. Verb structure is
doesn't have any
very
complication.
convoluted. When they start talking about the aorist tense, I roll my eyes. Anything else, Fred? Other questions?
I think it's interesting when you get into these.
You have to speak up.
I'm like Sharon. I grew up with, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and, this is this way, that was that way. So the more study that you get in, I think it brings the more questions and sometimes more frustration to me is to, well, how do we know that if we're saying what I grew up with isn't accurate, how much do we say is accurate? And I don't know who that was about the note taking, but I've always said that about Mary's speech. I said, how do we know that's what Mary said? I mean, and I have to tell you, I frustrate my husband a lot. But those are questions that I have, is how do we answer these questions? And so I would just wait patiently until the second coming and we'll find out.
Well, you're right. I mean, Mary's song, also known as the Magnificat, is an absolutely glorious prayer. But this is a 13 or 14-year-old girl, where did that come from? And
Yeah.
probably not highly educated. Yeah, well, that's the point.
I know where it came
That's
from.
exactly what you get to.
Probably didn't really.
Yes,
The
yes,
Lord.
Paul,
yes.
Paul, you will never get finite answers. We grew up with finite answers because we were young, and that's what we understood.
Yeah.
But the more you study, the more questions there are, and the only way you can answer those questions is through study and prayer.
So what are we teaching our kids as they grow up and go through all this? Are we teaching them some of this, that this may not have been the guys that really wrote this Bible?
Reggie once asked me to teach a short teen class on modern New Testament scholarship.
But he wanted to come.
First off, I had trouble having people come because their alternative for that Sunday school session was to go to scrapbooking with Kim Gregg.
Oh, well.
And so I might have 3 or
Go
4
have
kids
Coffee with Amy now.
in my class at any one time, but he asked me to raise these questions, and I did.
I had a few students.
And
And I
some,
think that's good. I think that's good to do that.
Yeah, he felt that by the time they get to be teenagers, they should be thinking about these things.
Because some of them go off to college and they're questioned in this way. And if they've never heard any of this before, they go, whoa, like Sherry and I kind of, whoa, well, if this isn't true, then what isn't true? What else isn't true?
Like when your daughter goes to UVA and comes home and says, there really may not have been an Abraham and Sarah. And I go, whoa.
Yep. The big one is the flood.
Yeah. Many flood
You
stories.
know, I mean, it's in the Old Testament. And I've got a great book about Noah's flood, which talks about it. But it's not a theological book. It's a combination of archaeology and geology. But that's not what we're talking about here.
National Geographic did a study and says there was a flood in the Black Sea.
Yes,
There
that's
were
the same book.
floods. Yeah.
Yeah,
That the
Yeah.
Black Sea used to be a lake.
Yeah.
That it was at a different level and separated from the Mediterranean by a plug where the Bosphorus Straits are. And the Bosphorus Strait plug blew and the Mediterranean flowed in and filled up the Black Sea.
So
yeah.
They found villages underneath the water. They found the old
They didn't find
riverbeds.
an ark.
I mean, and it was way before biblical times that
Wow.
that happened. Anyway, but the answer is prayer and study, and nobody can give you the right answer. I guess God can, if you can convince him. I wrestle with that every night in my night prayers. Is show me the way.
Well, we asked one of my daughters one time, we were talking about things, and it was probably Heather, because she was a religious studies major at UVA, but about, well, who do you think goes to heaven? She says, everybody. I'm like, whoa, oh. That makes me happy.
The deeper question is, what is heaven?
yeah.
So,
And do we go to heaven or does heaven come to us?
Come to earth.
And to go to N.T. Wright, it's heaven coming to us.
Yep.
So in
Paul,
so on earth.
you gave N.T. Wright a shout of approval.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
The book I've been using in our midweek Bible study in the evening is by Tim Keller on the resurrection. And he is drawn heavily on N.T. Wright's work in that regard and putting together that. So,
I have two books.
and in the material that we use Sunday morning,
Right.
that's prepared through Cokesbury, the writers there quite often refer to the work of N.T. Wright in the lessons that we study. So
This is also a Timothy Keller book, and he talks about N.T. Wright and called Jesus the King.
yeah.
ooh.
Oh,
Now we got the big
some
book.
tomes.
Yep. Here is
never read any of these.
here's Raymond Brown's book on the birth of the Messiah,
And there are 3 volumes.
entirely about the sections in the two Gospels on the birth of the Messiah. And here are his 2 volumes on the death of the Messiah. And again, there's 4 different descriptions of the death of the Messiah. So there are a lot of people who write a lot of things about that.
Yep.
N.T. Wright, here I'm dealing with Paul in 8 weeks.
Why doesn't Reggie write?
In 8 weeks. I have 2 volumes on the fundamentals of Paul by N.T. Wright. 2 big volumes.
When Reggie retires as a minister, he won't do it now. I think he will write. He certainly has read everything, and I think he might write. What do you think?
Quite possible.
So
We'll see.
Does studying more make things clearer or just make things muddier?
Depends on whether you study or just read one source. Fred, do you have something?
Oh, it's valid.
You either accept it or you study about it and pray about it. I mean, there are no finite answers. When I
Yeah.
talked about Revelation, was it Revelation where she said, I want my Bible stories the way I learned them in Sunday school.
No, it was
Genesis.
Genesis.
It was Genesis.
Katie Polk wanted her
No,
Bible.
it was Revolution.
Was it
And I was going to teach
Anyway.
Genesis. And one of the ladies says, no, I'm not going to take that. I like my Bible stories the way I learned them in Sunday school.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's comforting.
Right.
That's fine. And things like Reggie's Bible's Sunday school class, where he's taking Genesis and he's talking about some of the conflicts in Genesis. His subject today, which was how do we balance the two different flood stories in Genesis?
Yeah.
And if you haven't really taken that thing, the story of Noah apart, there are two stories
Okay, so that's the class in the
in the chapel.
He's got
chapel
two-
at 10 o'clock, at 10
Yep.
o'clock?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay,
Last week, he talked about the two creation stories in the first chapter of Genesis, first three chapters of Genesis. And so
doesn't get a
that's
lot
an interesting one, but he only has two people in that
Yeah.
class, or three.
well, the announcements in the Thursday letter don't identify that he's the one doing it.
I know.
You know what, Paul? You have a group of people already. Maybe you could talk Reggie into coming to your Sunday school class for a section of time to teach something like that. Because one of the things is the Sunday school classes, like the people they're with, they've been doing it a long time, and it's a fellowship as well as a class. So I think maybe that's the way to get some of this material. I don't know.
It's
You can
hard.
do it with this group.
Yeah,
Well-
you can. And that's what's happening now.
We'll put Crystal Kepley on it. She'll solve it.
No, I'm going to the chapel thing next time. I just didn't know about it until today. I
Okay.
just read about it in the bulletin today. I'm like, well, I didn't.
Because you
I
may
would
quit.
recommend it. It's a pretty good subject matter. I sat in on the last end of it last week, I guess. My Sunday school class was over and his was still going on. Now, my Sunday school class, hold on just a second. No, I'll call him back. My Sunday school class is built around Amy Jill Levine in the Old Testament. And yet I've got a video, great courses. We go 30 minutes and we talk. There are two people. There's Karen and Ron Harrell. That's it. And she's good.
This is one you do in 209.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's all, and we watched 30 minutes lecture. She's got 24 lectures on, and she's Jewish. And she talks about the Old Testament from a Jewish perspective.
Fairly orthodox, I think.
And she's pretty interesting, but
Yeah.
it's just two of us plus Karen.
Did she also do a video series in the great courses on the city of David, Jerusalem, and the archaeology?
She could have, I don't remember it.
Okay.
I have a, Bart Ehrman did one on the New Testament. Timothy Luke Humphreys did one on the history of the Bible. There are a number of interesting, great courses out there
Yeah.
that you can, and they put them on sale. I got mine through eBay, and so they were fairly cheap.
Yeah. Well, very good. Very good.
Any other questions? All right, I promised you one of the verses from First Thessalonians as the final prayer. And so here it is. I really like this. May the God of peace himself sanctify you entirely, and may your spirit and your soul and body be kept sound and blameless at the coming of our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
I just,
That's
All right.
verse 23
yep,
in chapter 4.
5.
5? I missed the, right. There it is. I had it covered with my thumb.
All right, next week will be Galatians. And as I say, it is an angry letter, and he says some angry, intemperate things in that letter. So it'll be different. All right,
Thank you, Pete.
thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Sure.
Peter,
Yes, ma'am.
what translation is your Bible that you use?
I use 3. I use the NRSV. I use the Amy Jill Levine's Jewish New Testament. I like its footnotes in terms of implying thing. And I use the, what's that other one, the something Bible. There's another one. It's a Bible that, no, it gives you, when there's a multiple translations of a word, it'll put the other translations in parentheses right after it. So as you go through, you can see how others have translated that particular word or phrase.
Interpreter's Bible?
No, it's
upstairs, I'm sure.
It's upstairs. I'll put it in the next
Okay.
email. I'll send it
Yeah.
out to you
Yeah.
on that. But I use all three of those. Plus I use the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, which has NIV and NRSV side by side. As it goes through it, it breaks the chapter down into segments, and you get them both side by side, and then you get a discussion of them both underneath it. And of course, that starts with an introduction to the entire book, and it finishes with some commentary on the entire book at the end. And so you get both of those translations in there.
Our entire dining room table is strewn with books. It's his office. Anyway.
Thank you.
Amplified Bible, were you thinking
That's
about
it.
that?
Amplified Bible.
Amplified,
Thank
yeah.
you very much. The Amplified Bible.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got one of those. I find them so distracting though. It's like, they're like, it's, but
Right.
it is really helpful.
It's distracting if you're reading it for continuity the first time. All right. But once
Study.
you've read it and you're trying to figure out the different things, looking at the verses and seeing the different translations is helpful.
Sure.
I have one more thing I wanted to tell you, because you and I talked about it because of my mask that I have that says Bench Jesus.
What? Bench Jesus. I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I have a mask that I bought from this. It's actually a television show, or it's a series that is supposed to keep very true to the Bible. It's called The Chosen. It's
Oh yeah, I know the
I've
Chosen.
seen it
Yeah.
advertised.
it's
but you
about
know-
it's basically mostly about the disciples, but the Jesus person is very down to earth, and I don't know, but they do make up sort of side stories, right? Alliteration, because it's the idea is that, like, we don't know the disciples. So for example, Matthew, we can kind of figure out a lot about him because he was a tax collector, and to be a tax collector, he was probably a pretty mathematical kind of guy. And also he would have had to have written things down. So so they actually made him kind of a what is this? What's that? On the spectrum. He's
Oh
kind of,
yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
but he's brilliant. He's a brilliant guy. Even the Romans realized what a brilliant guy he is. Now, again, all of this is just imagination on the part of the writers, but it is extremely entertaining, and they have like experts that work on the show, like a Jewish scholar and a Catholic scholar and a Christian sort of Protestant scholar who work on to verify that nothing about the Bible that they include is conflicting. Everything that is representing the Bible, like for example, there's one episode where he meets with Nicodemus,
Right.
and the words are from the Bible directly, and so everything, there's no conflict with the
So they're
Bible.
speaking Greek.
No.
No, they speak. They speak. It's really funny. That was their main decision. They actually have a special segment where they talk about how they decided to make it. I mean, look, Jesus is handsome. It's not going to be like
And he doesn't look like he's from the Middle East.
Jesus didn't speak Greek. Jesus spoke Aramaic.
Aramaic.
Exactly. So they have him speaking English with an Israeli accent. It's an Israeli accent, like people who live in And in
Oy
fact,
vey?
the guy who plays Peter,
That's
the
Yiddish.
guy who plays
Oh,
Peter
yeah.
is actually an Israeli
Right.
actor. So anyway, it's
So why do you want to bench Jesus? Because he's not a good character?
huh? Why?
Why
What?
do you want to bench Jesus? He's not portrayed correctly?
No, that's about no, binging means doing
Oh,
so much
bench.
of it, like,
I thought you said bench.
So did I.
Like keep him on the bench.
That's
Don't let him
exactly what I
play.
heard. That's exactly what I heard.
Like basketball
I
or
was- I was
football.
trying to get there.
young people do where they watch
Yeah.
like too many, like a whole series.
I know what binging is. I had the wrong word.
So you're supposed to watch this chosen series, just sit down and spend the whole weekend.
Yes,
like,
got it.
There was a PBS series on something called the Golden Legend. Golden Legend was written in 1300s, which outlines the whole life of the disciples and tracks them until they die. Now, how somebody in the 1300s could figure that out is beyond me. But it's a fairly long book, and it talks in great detail about their perspective of what happened to all of the individual disciples in their end of life experiences.
Okay.
So if you like The Chosen, any
I
other,
agree
I
on
do
a
like
chapter
the
more.
chosen. I like the focus on the disciples. Nobody really, I mean, I remember when Ralph Raleigh did that series on the disciples. And I just thought I had never learned. I mean, he started the sermon with like, what do a bat and a fuller bat and a sword and these things, all these things that the way they died. But, I mean, they were very interesting. I mean, doubting Thomas and all
Yeah.
it's I mean, these guys suffered tremendously for Christ. It was, I really admire them because we all aspire to be like them. And frankly, I don't think I have that kind of, that kind of sacrifice is unbelievable.
well, we go back to Thessalonians. Paul said in Thessalonians, Jesus suffered and so shall we.
So,
Other questions or comments? We will see you, or most of you, or many of you, or some of you, or one of you next week. I hope to be in person again with a recorded session next Sunday, and we'll deal with Galatians.
stay
Okay.
safe.
Thanks for setting this up.
At 4 o'clock?
4 o'clock.
All right, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.